you mentioned, sometimes people want that hierarchy. They want to look up to some guru with the answers. And I think hierarchical organization seems to be something in which narcissists kind of flourish, right? They seem to kind of adopt leadership roles very easily.
Very much. So we when we look at leadership, we break it down into two big areas, which is emerging leadership and effective leadership. And emerging leadership is, how likely are you to rise as a leader in an organization, whether it's a new group in a lab or a company or anything. There's a lot. We've looked at this all sorts of ways. And then effective leadership is, are you a good leader? Narcissism predicts emergent leadership. So people who are narcissistic will become leaders in new groups. They become leaders more quickly in family businesses. They become CEOs more. I mean, they just rise to leadership positions because they like the power. It gives them access to sex and status and things. And a lot of people I shouldn't be the leader. I don't know enough. How could I be a guru? But if you got a strong enough ego, you're like, yeah, I should be a guru. So narcissism it just rises to leadership. And when we don't have good mechanisms for leadership selection, that's what you get.
Right. And I think when I first kind of started learning about narcissism, as someone who's coming from the kind of strict science, maybe this would be too much of an overreach from your perspective, but I started to find that I found kind of human history started to make more sense as I understood this psychological trait in terms of this kind of hierarchical thing. And I was thinking that we're, at least in England, we're kind of, taught to see the kind of Roman Empire as this amazing thing and all of these kinds of, things throughout human history. But there's another way of looking at it where for majority of human history, we were living in these kind of decentralized egalitarian groups like hunter-gatherers, and then agriculture comes along and people can start to accumulate wealth and power, and then you get a hierarchy, and then the whole thing takes off. So I start to feel like to me, it makes sense that if the trait of narcissism and the ability to build hierarchies, it kind of co-evolved culturally. Does that sound far out, or does that sound like could be?
No, not in the slightest. My colleague Lenny Martin, who retired, but we used to talk about this a lot. He studied hunter-gatherers, and in a hunter-gatherer group, you go to a small group of hunter-gatherers, and there aren't many left. But if you go, you can talk to the Bushmen still, you can go to the Mentawais, talk to the people there. There's still, there's indigenous groups all throughout South America that are larger. But in those small groups, what happens is if you get out of hand, if you become a self-promoter, you start stealing stuff, you start, having sex with people's, wives, whatever partners or whatever you do, they don't want you in the group anymore. So they will kill you. And when you go read the old, the research on hunter-gatherer murders or deaths, what happens if somebody was really a bad guy, they just take you out and they'd have a family member just leave you. So like Lenny would say, yeah, they just have a hunting accident. Oh yeah, Keith, yeah, too bad. He was kind of a jerk. Too bad he got eaten by that tiger. Yeah, bummer. And so it was self-regulating. But what happened is as soon as people were able to get status, and then I was able to, and so one of the things was resources that you could carry around. So with hunter-gatherers, you don't really have resources to hoard. Once you were able to get resources, like in any sort of agriculture environment, and then you were able to get a group of people to protect you. So as soon as I was able to get a bunch of toadies around, I'm the arrogant guy, everybody's going to beat me up. But if I get 5 big dudes around me with knives or swords, and I'm like, you can't say anything about me. I got the big guys who are like, yes, sir. And then it's over. Then the power structure goes. The next thing you know, I'm the pharaoh, and you know who I am? I'm just a representation of the sun. You inflate, your ego inflates that much. I'm going to live forever. Build me a pyramid. Can you imagine how the ego inflated from a hunter-gatherer in North Africa to a pharaoh in 500 years? I don't know how long that period was. It's unbelievable. Yeah, that changed the whole thing. You look at all the data, it's like everything's fine, and then just boom.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, it's kind of, it makes me think as well of, the difference between how you present in the world, the messages you send out, and what's really going on under the surface. And so in a hunter-gatherer community, if you're in a family, everyone knows each other, you can't really get away with being that deceitful, and that kind of keeps everything in check. But I feel like as you get this kind of stratification, and also just with narcissism where it shows up, there's this distance, there's the mask, the image that's being presented, and then what's going on behind the scenes, which could be manipulation or whatever. And that's why I mentioned the Roman Empire earlier, because I see this like this kind of very successful PR strategy of, as you said, build these huge things. They looks amazing, but then when you think about the day-to-day life, slavery, all this stuff, the dirty underbelly and the mask are so distant.
Yeah, there was recent research in China looking at urbanization. This is something I figured here, but we don't really have good data from the US, but you see it in China where urbanization is sort of important for narcissism, because if you're in an urban environment, you have to meet more people. You don't have a reputation as clearly, so you can get away with more nonsense, more manipulation. So bigger environments, urban environments. But yeah, small community, everybody knows who you are. So you're like, yeah, there goes James. He's talking a big game, but we all know James is full of it. Yeah, that's how it is. But you get on social media, no one knows who you are. You can be anything. It's crazy. So whenever there's a gap between reality and fantasy, when you can kind of sneak ego in, you're going to see ego. And this happens all over the place. I mean, even if you ask people what your GPA is, people will tell you the truth. But if you're like, how are your grades compared to other people? They're like, well, mine are better. So whenever you give people, this is a basic social psych finding, when you give people the space to enhance themselves, they will often do it. Are you a good people person? Oh yeah, I'm a great people person. Well, how do you define people person? Well, I just define it the way that makes me look good. So people will always, not all, but people in general will manipulate the world to make themselves feel good. So when you have a space, but the people in narcissistic do this really well. And when you give them fantasy and social media and big cities, I mean, it's all over.